Greetings, Padawan. We are gathered together to talk about our good buddy Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne is an interesting cat. He is the first of our transcendental romantic writers that is going to tell some stories. And there's some pretty good stories. So some interesting facts about Hawthorne. One is he added the W to his name to distinguish himself from his great-great-grandfather, who was one of the leading judges involved in the Salem witch trials. So he was very ashamed of his family's history and his family's involvement with the witch trials, and so he added the W to confuse the issue. Some other interesting little tidbits about him: his daughter, his youngest daughter, Rose, has actually been nominated for sainthood. So she became Catholic. She turned Catholic with her husband, and her husband and her young son, I think he was 5, died. And after they died, she went to live in the tenements in New York City to provide aid and comfort and nursing to the poor that were ill, but especially for people with cancers. And she then became a nun and started an order and worked in the poorest parts of New York City and other larger cities, organizing people to help those with cancer. So that's an interesting little bit of information. And then another little tidbit of information is that he died and is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, right near Thoreau, the Alcotts. All of those folks are buried in the same section of Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, if you ever want to go visit. And but his wife and daughter died 7 years later in London, and they were buried there. So for 142 years they were separated, and then money was raised to bring his wife, whose name is Sophia, but we pronounce it Sophia down here, and they brought Sophia and their daughter home. So yet another interesting tidbit. And then another tidbit that will actually come up again. He was one of the co-founders of Brook Farm, which is what Blythedale Romance is based on. And it was this fad of the day to live communally and in these communes where you would all, think together and be writers together and have these intellectual conversations, and you would live off the bounty of the land. And so he was one of the co-founders of Brook Farm, but then soon realized that he didn't have time to write, and he had so many blisters from having to hoe potatoes, and he hated the farm work, so he got out of it. He still gave money to it, but he didn't want to live there. And later on, when we talk about Louisa May Alcott, she talks about her father Bronson. She said very interesting things about living in that communal setting as a child, because she said that everybody wanted to sit around and talk about philosophy and how good it is to raise your own food, and how morally upright people are when they live off the land and they don't rely on society to provide food and things like that, but nobody wanted to do the work, and so a lot of apples rotted and they had to eat rotten apples. And so Nathaniel Hawthorne thought about that also. His work is very interesting because it is full of symbolism. And so just a note about symbolism, and there's a lot in the module about symbolism and how, the different kinds of symbols that exist, and we're going to talk about them in some of the stories that you're reading, but just a cautionary tale, because symbols change over time. So, things like color, white usually means innocence and purity and virginity, and black usually means sin, death, or sickness. It's called the Black Plague, right? So, those are kind of universal symbols, and those still hold the same meanings today. But some symbols have changed over time, and we can actually see that in our own area. Over in Allentown, the original post office has swastikas in the marble floor, and you might think, oh my goodness, why would they have that in the floor? That's because the symbol, that the two fours together, that symbol used to mean peace, and Hitler adopted that symbol for the Nazi party, and so prior to his using it, it meant something else, but now we come to see that image as a symbol of peace, but the post office was built before Hitler rose to power, and before that symbol was used for his purposes. So you can see that in old stonework, you'll see the Nazi symbol, but it didn't mean that when they put it there. We could say the same thing about the rainbow, which has been adopted by the LGBTQ plus community. It didn't always mean or symbolize that movement, but now when you see rainbow, often it does. So just keep it in the back of your mind as you're looking at symbols, that we have to look at the symbols that Nathaniel Hawthorne uses in the context which he would have known them to be used for, and not in the way that we might use those symbols today. So keep that in mind. So let's talk about the 4 short stories I asked you to read. Now, I'm going to have you read them, and for those of you who are watching this on Facebook, these videos go into a quiz platform that the students answer questions about, and some are multiple choice and some are long answer. So I'm going to ask some questions here that they're going to respond to in the testing platform Edpuzzle, but you can think about these at home if you're not watching that way. So the first story we're going to look at is The Birthmark. And The Birthmark is an excellent short story that really illustrates the war between science and nature, right? So I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but it's definitely a story about the struggle between science and nature. And really that is, also the struggle between the Romantic movement and the Enlightenment movement and the realist movement that will come after, and what we consider perfection, right? So something to pay attention to in the story is there's a point where the wife sings and it makes the husband feel better. And that's, singing is a natural thing. So nature really is the winner here. And then something dramatic happens when science is used to solve the main issue that the husband has. And that's what Hawthorne thinks about science, right? So he's attempting to control nature. So you've read the story, you have it open in front of you. I hope, as I've instructed you in the guidelines for this quiz, what is he trying to do? What is he trying to do with science? And so that's question 1. What is he trying to do? And do you think that we're doing that today? With all of the things that we have on the market, with all of the things that we put out there for people, are we trying to do the same thing? And will our success be the same as his? So that's your thought. Sorry to be cryptic to those of you who don't get a chance to answer in the quiz portal, but this story really makes us think about perfection and nature versus science. So, all right, the next story that you'll read, and I'm not sure if these are the order in which they're listed in your module, but you'll figure it out, is A Minister's Black Veil. And The Minister's Black Veil is full of symbolism again, which is, sort of the hallmark of Hawthorne's work. The veil itself is a symbol, black being the color, symbolizes sin, right? So this story is interesting because it doesn't have an answer at the end. He never says if there is a big sin that causes him to wear this veil. He's just saying that we all have hidden sin. We all have sin. And so he was asked twice to remove it. The first time he's asked to remove it by his fiance, and he refuses, and she breaks up with him. So he lives his entire life alone, but still wearing the veil. On his deathbed, somebody asked if they could remove it, and he said no, it couldn't be removed until he died. So he wore this thing. It was his choice. And it's some interesting points. The way that it's written, Hawthorne suggests that he's a better minister because he's so separated from society. This veil made him a better preacher, but it did separate him from society. And, it says a lot about what he thinks about the puritanical Puritan religion or puritanical way of life, because they completely change their feelings about this man based on an article of clothing. And he's young when the story starts. The story sees him through. In the beginning, he goes to regular church with this veil on, doesn't explain it. He oversees a death, and people assume, well, maybe he was doing something with the girl that died. Maybe that's why he's wearing the veil, because he was doing something naughty with her and cheating on Elizabeth. But there's no proof of that. And then later on, he does a marriage and he wears it, and then he makes the wedding depressing, and everybody's kind of irritated that he did that. But he says, in the story, that all humans have sin. We all have sin, and are we hiding from it, or are we trying to pretend we don't have it? And he's the more honest man for having worn it. And so my questions for you are, what are our symbols for sin today? Right? And, before I ask you that question, I want to point out that in the beginning of the story, there's a footnote. And in that footnote, he says, there's this other dude who wears the veil. He's up in Maine, but he wears it because he accidentally killed his childhood friend. So Hawthorne chooses to put that there. Remember, this is fiction, right? So he chooses to put that there as if to say, there are other people who wear veils, but we know why they're wearing their veils. We have no idea why this dude's wearing this veil, right? So that's kind of why he puts it there as a sort of device to help us understand that, other people do this, but there were reasons and they could figure it out. But he doesn't give us any answer. So the big question is, one, why does he wear it? Why do you think he wears it? No right or wrong answer, but what do you think based on your reading of it? And then two, what do we have today to symbolize sin? Is it still just the colors black and red? Are there other things that symbolize death? Pictures or phrases or, images, when you see what, does it remind you of death, and is that the same or different from him? So it's probably a little bit more of a complicated question to think about, but if you think about images like one obvious one is the Grim Reaper, right? If you see the Grim Reaper, that represents death, so that's a symbol of that. But what symbols do we have for sin? Right? Or do we not do that anymore because we're not that religious as a society? So those are your questions for Minister's Black Veil. Then you have a song that you probably didn't read in high school called The Wives of the Dead. And this is an interesting story. It's a very short story. But the reason I like it is because it deals with two different women, and it deals with two different women's approach to loss. So that's interesting in itself, right? Mary is, mild and quiet, but she's not a pushover. She's strong, but she's mild and quiet, and she relies on her faith. And then Margaret is, irritable, and she's bitter, and she's loud, and that's how she deals with the loss. And then in the end, they find out that their husbands aren't dead. And then you're like, do I even trust the narrator, right? Like, do I trust the person telling this story? Is this a dream? Is this a dream story? So questions for you are, do you think it's a dream? Yes or no? And why? And what do you think Hawthorne is saying about Mary and Margaret and how they deal with loss, right? So, good story. The last story, which I don't have here, is Young Goodman Brown. I don't have that up here, but that's okay. You can find it because you'll have read it. So Young Goodman Brown is about the fall of man, right? So there's innocence versus experience. He goes into the woods innocent. He comes out experienced. And what does that do? And it's interesting because he is the first character that we call one of the dark romantics. We'll see more of them when we talk about Poe. This idea that nature isn't, because he goes into these dark woods and they're sinister, and that nature can have a dark side. We see in Thoreau and Emerson the light side of nature, but in this particular piece, we see the dark side of nature and the fall of man. And it's interesting because it's really a commentary on what Hawthorne thinks about American religion and sort of the hypocrisy that goes along with it. And so what I'm interested in knowing from you is, after reading this, what do you think Hawthorne thinks of religion? What is his take on American religion? And do you agree or disagree? So these are the stories that you are reading for this this section. If you had this course, in the summer, you will also read the Blithedale Romance, which has its own separate lecture notes for it. Those of you taking it during winter session, don't read that because there's just not enough time. But again, that's full of imagery and full of symbolism and sort of these, good versus evil and young versus old and pure versus experience and nature versus nurture and science versus nature and reason versus imagination. Hawthorne is known for all of these, these different sort of elements in his work. And so he makes that, he's our first, truly American fiction writer, because remember, we have others, right? We have Rip Van Winkle, but that's sort of a cusp piece because it lends from the previous movement. So Hawthorne is really our first true fiction writer, and very involved in the transcendental movement and in the Romantic movement. So you'll get separate notes for transcendentalism because that's its own thing entirely, and I want to make sure that that's pretty clear, but this is your ditty to get you started on Hawthorne. All right, Padawan, I'll see you soon.